It's been a long journey these past few episodes, but we finally have the transmission and the transfer case rebuilt and ready to be bolted back together. We'll start by getting the completed transmission off the bench and onto the transmission jack. To make this as easy as possible, we'll be using the engine crane to move around the transmission. We'll set it down on the transmission jack and get it safely secured with the chain. Then we'll get that out of the way. Before we can bolt the transfer case and transmission back together, we have to reattach the transfer case adapter. So we'll get the adapter studs cleaned up with the wire wheel, apply some thread locker, and then install them into the transfer case by tightening two nuts against each other. We'll repeat this process for all 6 studs, then make sure the surface is clean and install a new gasket. We gave this one a light coat of WD-40. And with that in place, we'll make sure the adapter itself is clean and slide it into place. Of course, we want to double check and make sure we install it with the transfer case clocked correctly. Then we'll apply a little bit of anti-seize to each of the studs and thread on the nuts. This bracket also attaches to the 2 driver's side studs. Then we'll go around and tighten down the nuts in a crisscross pattern. Once they're fairly tight, we'll get out the torque wrench and torque them to spec. For the 2 that we can't get our torque wrench on, we'll just make sure they're nice and tight. And with the adapter reinstalled, we'll hook up the transfer case to the engine crane just like we did with the transmission and get it off the bench. Once it's in the air, we'll swing the crane around and get the transfer case lined up with the transmission. We'll make sure the mating surfaces are clean and then oil and install a new adapter seal. Then we'll line everything up bit by bit until everything is lined up well enough to get the transfer case output shaft splines into the input shaft of the transfer case. Then we'll hold those in place and start threading in the 6 bolts. Once they're all started, we'll go around and get them all snugged down and then start tightening them. We can't really get the torque wrench on these either, so we'll just go ahead and get them all nice and tight. And with that done, we'll lower down the transmission jack and unhook everything from the engine crane. And we finally have the transmission and transfer case bolted back together. But before we start installing them, there are a few things we have to take care of first. First up, while the fender liner is out and everything is accessible, I'd like to get an old issue taken care of. The exhaust manifold bolts on this truck aren't exactly in great shape, and that's a common problem. A few years back, we noticed the head was broken off of one of the driver's side bolts, so we removed them all, pulled the manifold away from the head, and were able to use channel locks to remove the rest of the broken bolt. Then we installed 6 new bolts, hopefully stronger ones, with a liberal amount of anti-seize. On the passenger side, we only replaced the front bolt, which is why it looks different from the rest. The bolts that break on these engines are usually in the front or all the way in the back. When we removed the broken bolt from the driver's side, we also noticed the rearmost passenger side bolt was also broken. But since this one was harder to get to and there was less of the broken bolt left in the cylinder head, we kinda just decided to leave it alone. As far as I know, it never caused any exhaust leaks, but I definitely like to get it taken care of. So, today's that day. We'll start by pulling all of the spark plug wires out of the cylinder head to get them out of the way. These can also be hard to remove when they've been on there for a while. It's been a few years since these boots have been pulled off the plugs, so it does take some force, but since that inner fender liner's out, the angle makes it pretty easy. And with those out of the way, we'll go ahead and put the impact gun on each one of these exhaust manifold bolts. We'll start on the edges of each part of the manifold and remove the bolts moving inward. Also, we'd better cross our fingers that none of these break. Luckily for us, the 5 remaining bolts came out without a fight. Now the only thing holding in the exhaust manifold is the oil dipstick tube, so we'll go ahead and remove its hold down bolt and try to remove it. I say try because unfortunately the dipstick tube is pretty stuck in the engine block and doesn't want to come out. All the movement you're seeing here is from the tube bending. Eventually we just decided to give up on it since we didn't want to cause any more issues than we already have. So to remove that broken bolt, we'll just pull the exhaust manifold as far out of the way as we can. And now we can take a better look at what's remaining in the cylinder head. There's more of the bolt sticking out than I thought there would be, so it probably would be possible to remove it with channel lock pliers. But since this is at the rear of the engine bay, it turned out to be pretty difficult to get anything back there. So we'll just take the normal route and we'll fit a nut over that broken piece of bolt and weld it on. The strategically placed cardboard will hopefully keep most of the welding slag out of the cylinders and exhaust manifold. Unfortunately, because of the funny angle, the weld slag built up in such a way that we couldn't get a socket on that nut. So once it's cooled down, we'll remove it the old-fashioned way, 1/6 of a turn at a time with an open end wrench. Despite it being annoying, this works and pretty soon that broken bolt has been removed. Looking at the exhaust manifold gasket, it's obvious which port was missing a bolt. It never had enough of a leak to be audible, but it does seem like the gases were probably seeping out. We'll go ahead and just clean up that outer surface of the gasket with a Brillo pad and hopefully it'll be okay. Then, once we're sure the cylinder head is clean enough, we'll go ahead and start reinstalling the manifold. We'll start by liberally applying anti-seize to one of our new bolts and installing it through the manifold and the gasket. And once everything is hung up by one bolt, we'll go ahead and do the same for the other 5. We'll also reinstall the bolt for the oil pickup tube hold down, although we'll have to carefully bend some of it back since clearly we tweaked it a little by trying to remove it. And once all the bolts have been installed, we'll snug them all down and then torque them to spec. Since the front 3 bolts are on one section of the manifold and the back 3 are on another, we're basically following a spiraling outward torque sequence on each separate flange. As for the oil pickup hold down bolt, we'll just get that nice and tight. And then all we have to do is reinstall the spark plug wires and that repair is complete. But we're not done with this exhaust manifold yet. Remember that stud that we cut off to get the exhaust off in the first place? Yeah, we're gonna have to deal with that. The first thing we'll try is threading on a nut and welding it in place. Since the stud was long enough that we had access to both sides, we welded both sides and got everything nice and hot. While everything was hot, we sprayed on some PB Blaster to hopefully get into those threads. We repeated this a few times until it was cool enough that it didn't turn to smoke upon contact. And once we had given it plenty of time to cool down, we put on the impact gun and gave it a go. The stud in the manifold didn't even budge, all we did was snap more of it off. It seems like that stud is just so stuck in the exhaust manifold that when we heated it up like that, we made a new weak point. We tried this a few more times, but every other time the weld just wasn't working out. Since the stud was now too short to get a good weld on both sides, we just couldn't make it strong enough. These studs are some kind of stainless steel, which is probably why the nuts were seized so bad in the first place and why the welding was being a little problematic. In the end, we returned to the angle grinder and just cut off the rest of the stud. Then we started the process of drilling it out. We quickly discovered that those studs are pretty frickin' hard and only the Cobalt drill bits would even touch them. So drilling it out under the truck, pushing up so hard that the engine was lifting up and hot metal shavings were falling in my face was a fun experience. The plan had been to remove the exhaust manifold and do this off the truck, but we were scared of breaking the oil dipstick tube and having to deal with that. A drill guide certainly would have helped, but I think the engine lifting up from how much force I was applying was what made everything go a little bit screwy. At some point, even the focus on the camera decided it had seen enough. But all that's happening here is finishing up the drilling and the laborious tapping process. And once we had new threads, we could install a new stud. It's hard to see on camera, but the stud isn't 100% straight. But since the flange on the Y pipe has pretty large holes for the bolts, hopefully it won't be an issue. Honestly, if I had to do this again, I wouldn't have tapped it at all. I simply would have used a slightly undersized bolt and nut to hold everything together. But this is what we're working with for today. We'll go ahead and put some anti-seize on a new exhaust stud and get it threaded into place. And now that that's done, we need to get the truck rolled into the garage. That engine and trans is still hanging out in the back of it. All we did was stick some jack stands under the frame to take some of the weight off the rear tires. So we'll get those out of the way and push it into the garage. Then we'll jack up the truck and get it about as far off the ground as we can. And now we'll really get to work. Just like when taking it out, we'll go over the time lapse of it and just cover the basic steps. We'll start by getting the transmission cross member back out and pulling all of our wires and hoses out of the way. At this point, we also put some anti-seize on our dowel pin and tapped it back into the engine block. Then we need to get our transmission on our jack back under the truck. This is easier said than done. To help us out some, we'll lift the front of the truck even more until it's actually past the top adjustment notch on the jack stands. Then we'll have to pick up the transfer case in the back of the transmission jack and get the whole thing underneath the frame. And once it's been shoved under the truck, we'll lower down the jack stands and get everything set back down again. So now we'll jack everything up until we can get it at the right angle and in the right place to bolt back up to the engine. Eventually, we get it there and get all the bell housing to engine bolts installed. It took a bit of patience, but eventually they were all threaded in. And once everything was together and the bolts were snug, we made sure the transmission was fully seated on the engine. Then we went around and torqued all the bell housing bolts to spec. Then we installed each of the torque converter bolts, made sure the torque converter was flush against the flex plate, and then torqued them down using thread locker. It's a huge help to have somebody hold the crank still while you tighten these, but you can certainly put a breaker bar on there, or jam a pry bar between the flex plate and the bell housing to hold everything still. Then we'll basically go around and get all the linkages, wires, and hoses back into place. We'll also hook back up the transmission cooler lines. If there was metal debris in the lines or something else serious, you'd want to do a full flush of the transmission cooler in the radiator. Since our transmission was fine and the fluid was just a bit dirty, we just sprayed it out with brake clean and some low pressure compressed air and moved on. And once most things have been connected, we'll go ahead and reinstall the transmission crossmember. Then we can remove the transmission jack and tighten down the transmission mount. We'll also reinstall the starter, torque it to spec, and reattach the wires. We really should have installed the front drive shaft before the transmission crossmember, but eventually we still got it installed. And once all its hold-down bolts are in and torqued to spec, we can install the rear drive shaft as well. That one's an easier install, and once we remember to turn off the parking brake, we will get all those torqued down as well. Then we have to reinstall the Y-pipe. Once again, I realized I got a little ahead of myself installing the transmission crossmember, and that's going to have to come back out. So with the crossmember removed and the transmission jack holding up on the transfer case, we'll get the Y-pipe up onto the studs and thread on some new steel nuts with plenty of anti-seize. Then we'll reinstall the transmission crossmember so that we can get the jack out of the way and get the rest of the exhaust reinstalled into the hangers and bolted back on. Then we'll torque everything down to spec. Luckily, everything mates up just fine, and it doesn't seem like that slightly crooked exhaust stud is going to cause any issues. Then we'll go around one final time and make sure everything is connected and tight. We'll plug in all the oxygen sensors and reinstall the one we had to remove. Then we'll go ahead and reinstall the inner fender liner and everything else that's still sitting around. We'll also finish getting our transmission pressure gauge set up and make sure the hose for it reaches into the cabin so that we can watch it as we change gears. We'll go ahead and refill the transfer case and the transmission with fluid. As mentioned in an earlier video, as soon as we filled it up, we noticed a significant leak from that drain plug. But we won't get into that again, and suffice to say we took care of it, at least for now. So, with everything full of fluid and the battery reconnected, we'll go ahead and give everything its first test. It starts quickly and easily as if it hadn't been sitting for months, and the transmission line pressure comes up to where it should be almost instantly. We stopped it pretty quickly because we wanted to get out and look around for any obvious problems or obnoxious leaks. Since everything still looked good, we went ahead and started it up again. The bouncing needle is normal for now since the oil has to flow into all the parts of the system. Even after a pre-fill, a lot of the torque converter is still empty. Plus there's the transmission cooler and everything inside of the transmission itself. But as it keeps going, the pressure starts to waver and drop, and we'll go ahead and shut it off. It's nothing to worry about yet, it just means we haven't put enough fluid in the system. So we'll add more fluid and then give it another go. This repeats 2 more times as I seem to have underestimated how much fluid I needed to put back in. This time the transmission pressure was getting a little bit funny, so we went ahead and shut it off and put in more fluid. You might notice the jump from night to daytime because I had to go out and buy more fluid, and by the time we were finally ready to do those test starts, all the stores were closed. By this point, we've had the truck idling for a few minutes, so everything is starting to get warm, and we've rode through all the gears. Once we let everything equalize in each gear, the pressure is just what we're looking for. And now, the needle is nice and steady in gear. We also check to make sure that the line pressure rise is working properly by giving it a little bit of gas in each gear. Everything seems perfect, so time to see if it'll actually turn the wheels. With the truck still off the ground, we'll first test overdrive with the transfer case in 2-wheel high. It definitely wants to go, and everything seems to be working properly. So we'll keep it in overdrive and shift it into 4-wheel high. Still looking good, and other than the slightly rusty brakes, no weird grinding noises or clunks. So, let's shift it into 4 low. For this one, I'll take my foot completely off the brakes. And now for a bit of a big moment, we'll shift it back to 4-wheel high and try reverse. Now let's try loading the engine up by holding the brakes while it's in reverse. Doing this before rebuilding the transfer case would have resulted in an earth-shattering clunk. But now it seems like everything is working perfectly. Ideally, you'd drive around a little bit and keep watching the pressure on that gauge, But since we didn't feel like putting any sealer on this thing, it's leaking from everywhere, and we didn't really want to leave a trail of oil all over the place. This is also less important on a computer-controlled transmission like the 4L60E, and much more important on a transmission like the 700R4, which uses a throttle valve cable which needs to be set just right to get the right line pressures. But for us, we'll go ahead and remove the hose and reinstall the original plug with thread sealant. Then we'll get the truck off of jack stands and set it back on the ground. And now that it's warmed up and back on all four wheels, we'll go ahead and check the transmission dipstick with the engine idling and transmission in park. The fluid level is looking good, it's actually a little bit above the hot line. And with that, it's finally time to give it a chance to move under its own power. So it moves backwards and forwards. That's a big relief, but also big whoop. We need to make sure it actually drives. So we checked the fluid level one more time and then took a drive around the yard. The truck performed flawlessly, but we do need to get that engine and transmission out of the back before we really start driving it around. No problem, we'll go ahead and unwrap it and lift it out of the bed. And with that load off, we'll finally hit the road. We took it for an hour-long drive and made sure to hit all kinds of different road surfaces and speeds. And, well, the drive was uneventful because it worked fine. It's kind of funny that the drive being just normal was actually exciting because it was nice to be able to drive this truck again. Other than the Corvette servo, which definitely firmed up some shifts, it's about the same as before. Eliminating the PWM function on the torque converter clutch solenoid worked great, and the lockup is nice and firm. After this first test drive and letting it cool down a little bit, we changed the oil and filter. The mileage wasn't too high, but it had been quite a while and had been sitting around a whole lot since the last oil change. And of course, we've kept an eye on the transmission fluid and everything still looks good. The transfer case has behaved itself and shifts into gear much more easily than before. It's taken a long time to get all these videos edited, so in the meantime, we've put almost 3,500 miles on the truck. And it's treated us very well. For the most part, other than the slightly firmer shifting, it drives just like it did before. Which is a bit of a weird compliment considering how much work we did, but it's really the result we were looking for. So it's a big relief to finally be able to move on to something else. But this is definitely not the last you'll see of this truck. At the very least, there's a few small things like a transmission cooler that I would like to get installed. But as a people hauler, a toy hauler, and a general support vehicle, this truck will definitely continue to get work done.